was it like living in Loveland? At an early age, I think I would say sheltered. It was safe. I think we felt cherished, definitely loved. Oh gosh, it was a beautiful place to live. Of course, that was in the 50s, and times were lovely in the 50s. It was a small community of about 6,500, maybe 7,000 people. Everybody knew everybody. If you had a problem as a child, you could literally go to any door in Loveland and someone would take care of you or call your parents. It was a nice place to be.
You could leave early in the morning, like on a Saturday, get up and go out and play, and basically the only rule was be back for supper.
Exactly.
We used to ride our bikes all over town. Things like we'd get our 22 rifles, ride through town in our bikes, something you probably wouldn't do nowadays, and come out to the dump and shoot rats.
The boys did that. The girls didn't do that.
Very few girls were out there shooting rats. But anyway, it was nobody stopped you when you did things like that.
Okay, I have a little vignette about the dump, the city dump. And it was right where the recreation trail is now. But Conball used to come and take our boys to the dump, and they thought that was just wonderful.
He'd come and collect whatever we needed to throw away in the dump. You know, the city does it now with our collection system.
Yeah, but it was just a place where you threw garbage and stuff that you didn't want anymore. And I had just given birth to somebody, probably Carrie or Jill, and Marge Gregg had given me her maternity clothes. So I wore those maternity clothes, and I put them in my car, and I gotten everything all cleaned up, and I was going to take them to Marge. Well, I went to the dump on the way, and I started throwing things in the dump, and I thought, I just kept throwing. I got to Marge's house, and her clothes weren't there. And I obviously threw them away, and with great fervor. It was such fun to go there.
If the wind was blowing from the south, it wasn't very pleasant up on the hill because all the smoke would come up there.
In the summer, we played in this lake day and night, had so much fun, and then there were ballparks downtown, and I was the youngest of two other older siblings, and my brother and sister were always very jealous because my mother and father had me late in their life, and they were kind of over it and didn't want to have to bother with kids much. I would leave in the morning after breakfast on my bicycle with Evan Patterson and Doug Arion, and we'd ride all around Loveland, and you couldn't get in trouble because everybody knew you. And they'd say, Conball, did you know Richard was down at the pool hall? Well, I wouldn't go to the pool hall. You couldn't, because he'd know it, and I knew he'd know it.
You know, when we came to town after you were here a while, you literally would know almost everybody on the street. Now you go down and you hardly know anyone.
You rarely know someone on the street.
Oh, we went over to Lincoln Grade School and played on their playground and built forts and did great stuff. We'd end up down at the creamery. Dad did a great thing. He had a charge account at the local creamery because he was trying to get me beefed up for football. And I could charge malts, and I could charge them with my friends. So I was very popular. And, we'd get a malt every day in the afternoon. And then we'd go to the swimming pool. There was a really fun swimming pool. The Foots had donated money for a downtown outdoor swimming pool. It's right next to the Armory building. There's some other stuff in there now. But that had been carved out as a nice big outdoor swimming pool. Synchronized swimming. The girls put on synchronized swimming shows for us. And, if you weren't an idiot and you were a boy, you'd go down and see those. I mean, that was the thing to do. It was 6,000 people when I was in grade school. And by the time I graduated and left, it had grown to 12,000. It was very cohesive, very small, and everybody knew everybody.
Well, I lived one house away from the tracks, west of the tracks on the 10th Street, and the train seemed to stop lots of times and block traffic. And so whenever that I was on the wrong side of the tracks, like I was east of it and was coming home, if the train was stopped, sometimes I'd take my bike and drag it underneath the train when it wasn't moving, of course, and just to get home. I mean, it didn't seem like it wasn't a worrisome thing. It seems kind of silly now that I think about it, but that's the kind of thing we did. My dad always rode a bike to work downtown, so he rode back and forth. Lunch, came back home for lunch, so he rode back and forth his whole life, and so that was just the way we did things.
He learned it from his father.
The Loveland Steam Laundry, which is still there on 403 West 4th Street, and it's Loveland's longest continuous family business. My eldest brother's children now own it, and their children are working there, and I'm not sure we're down to the grandchildren, for his grandchildren yet. I started probably about age 8 or 9 sweeping. It's a pretty good sized place and when in a laundry you have lint, and so I had to sweep it kind of regularly. And then I also shoveled coal for the boiler, some. That's before we had gas, and so that was, I spent until about age 23 working there, pretty steady. I never had to look for a job because it was always automatic. The clients for the laundry it was family business, was a lot of it. Ordinary family things, because not everybody had home washing machines in those days. Yeah. Some did, of course. But we had a lot of family business. That has since kind of disappeared. But the motel business is a really big deal, particularly in the 50s, where that really grew. And we did most of the motels in town. And like the YMCA in Estes Park, we did that, which was a huge customer.
I actually worked at the laundry briefly when they needed a lot of help, and Steve and I were dating in high school. That was only in the summer. Primarily I worked as a waitress, like most of us did, but my biggest fun job was at the Rialto Theater, which was one of my favorite places to go. I was very anxious to work there. I thought I could be an usher, but I was actually hired to sell tickets. So I got to sell tickets in the booth that was sitting right outside, a big glass booth right on the sidewalk. And I thought that would be extremely glamorous and very exciting. Turned out to be quite boring. I got to see a few people driving up and down, but once people had purchased their tickets, there was nothing really for me to do except to sit there and watch. So it wasn't quite as glamorous as I expected. One of the things that I loved to do about having fun in Loveland was to go to the movies. I was very fond of movies, and of course I could only go on the weekends. But you need to know that it was 14 cents to get into the Rialto, and I got a quarter to go to the movie theater. So I would spend 14 cents on my ticket. I would go to either Macy's or Draper's, which was right down the street, and buy a large big hunk candy bar for a nickel and a Black Cow sucker, which was caramel with chocolate on top of the caramel, for a nickel, which left me 1 cent, which I would buy bubble gum. It was the best afternoon in the whole world. Children in particular, and adults, got a lot of national and international news by going to the movies, because we didn't have TV, not until late 50s. Mid-50s in Loveland anyway. And so you'd watch the newsreel, which is exactly what it was called, plus Time Marches On.
Yeah.
And then we'd have a serial on Saturdays, was a cowboy serial of Cassidy or Roy Rogers or Gene Autry. And then generally on Sunday, there would be a musical, which was my very favorite.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to say a little bit about the Rialto Theater, because it was built when Julia, Lynn's mother, went to the first opening of the Rialto Theater. Then it went into a period of embarrassment. And it turned into a mini mall because there wasn't a plan, there wasn't a group of people who could take charge of the theater. So it just kind of molded along. There were movies, but there was this big festoon of tar hanging from the ceiling. And it had been there for years, but you always wondered when it was going to fall.
Well, it was, it was very active. The downtown. The downtown. It was, there were several churches downtown, and all the car garages, as they called them then, were downtown. We had a gamble store. We had the GE people were downtown. We had probably 5 or 6 nice women's clothing shops. There were 2 men's clothing shops, and of course all the banks, and each one was separate. It didn't have banks in other areas of town.
Well, downtown Loveland was very vibrant, much different. It's coming back now, but I mean, we had 3 drugstores, we had 3 hardware stores, several women's clothing stores, and several men's clothing stores. And it was, Loveland High School was where Bill Reed is now, and it was the core. There was nothing outside. There was, I mean, Eisenhower was the north end of the city. The west end of the city was over, just west of the lake here. And then, of course, the sugar factory was the dominant employer in those days. But it was a very modest agricultural town, but it had a vibrant downtown. We bought everything, local grocery stores, a lot of probably 4 or 5 small little neighborhood groceries around the town, which was fun. And then eventually a Safeway came in.
Downtown, one of the things I remember the most about downtown was, of course, the Rialto Theater. But downtown really kind of existed from what is Grant Avenue, all the way straight down 4th Street to Adams. And pretty much everything was on both sides of 4th Street, with the exception of Cleveland and Lincoln, and there were businesses that maybe moved up to 5th Street, 6th Street. So downtown was pretty easy. So when we walked to school, of course, practically from everywhere you lived. I don't even recall I think we had bus service to the kids way out in the country, but not in town. So everybody walked to school. And we would walk through town and always back home through town. Merchants were always particularly good to young teenagers and young children in Loveland. We've always felt like we were appreciated and liked, and we were not chased away. Good merchants. And of course, most of our parents knew the owners of the shops, and we shopped there. So because Loveland was so small, again, we were safe. It was fun. We felt like we belonged, and it was our town. Well, we had a Draper's Drug on the corner, and Kitty Wampus from Draper's Drug was Macy's drugstore. And Steve and I have often heard that a lot of advertising for Macy's drugstore was that we're the drugstore with the stoplight, because there was only one in Loveland. We had a Woolworth's, we had a J.C. Penney's, we had men's stores, women's stores. Bates was a store. Some of you may know Roger Bates. His father owned a dress shop. Mock's, shoe stores.
Yeah.
Ferguson's Hardware was the place to go. If you needed anything in town, he had it.
You could go in and say, I'm looking for, the most odd thing. And he'd go, well, maybe, let me see. And Mr. Ferguson would go back and scrounge around, and pretty soon he'd come out with whatever it was. They had everything.
Most of the businesses stayed open Saturday mornings, 5 days plus Saturday morning. And you could walk downtown and get anything that you needed, and there were shops for that. There was a ladies' shop, there was a men's shop. there was a grocery store that had wooden floors and sawdust on the floors. It was Fred and Fred's.
Fred Fishburne and Fred Pomeranka. And it was on the corner of 4th and Cleveland.
Loveland was always the poorest community in this region. The salesmen used to come to Loveland, they'd always come to Loveland as their last stop. And whatever was left in their trunk, they'd dump off on our merchants, because you wanted to go to Boulder, Longmont, Greeley, or Fort Collins, Cheyenne even. Yeah, Loveland was very small.
We were talking the other day about how Loveland has changed. And for example, when we came, they had a passenger train that came through town. And tell them about the kids.
And we kept having these kids, and they love to have adventures. So we arranged for them to put on their jammies and their bathrobes and get on the passenger train in downtown Loveland. And when they got to Cheyenne, Wyoming, my parents would meet them. And they did this often.
And then we remembered we had a bus station, just a little
Anyway,
building.
it was just a little bus station.
And we had an airport in Loveland when we moved here. It was a little sandy strip out where Kmart is now. And Marv Lamb was the operator of the airport, and he taught, it was apparently quite the thing for some of the people in town to learn to fly. When he came to town, it was strictly private flying. People used the strip. And then the federal government came out with a program where they wanted to create regional airports. And Loveland was right on top of it. We got our application in right away. And they optioned the land from Tom McKee out to where the current airport is. And Fort Collins finally woke up that, hey, Loveland's going to be the regional center. And so Loveland was very gracious, though. They allowed us to amend our application, and if Fort Collins would pay, I believe it was 70% of the cost, we would let them in on the project, which turned out to be a really good thing for Loveland. And we allowed them to have their name first, Fort Collins Loveland, since they put in the lion's share of the money.
And you know, it was the first sugar beet factory, and so it was very interesting. There were Germans from Russia who had done sugar beets in Russia for Catherine the Great and on forward, and Claude Betcher from Denver, in his wisdom, saw that our area is similar to Bavaria, where the beets were being grown. So that was really the main agriculture was the main force in Loveland. And since we are a university town, it was kind of a retirement place. It was 5,000 people, which made it really a pretty small town. And I do remember those old Germans would sit out in the sunshine in front of Woolworths and McDonald's, which was McDonald's was a department store, and they had an iron bench that was across the street from the Rialto Theater that was just a perfect place for them to sit in the sun and speak German to each other.
Reporter Herald's been here for a long time. Has been here. It was here when Con Ball worked with them. But one of the first things, there was a kind of a newspaper war, because there was a feeling that the Reporter Herald didn't do much in the line of news work. And so there was another newspaper that was started up. And they were going to show the Reporter Herald. Well, of course, the Reporter Herald had the circulation, and that didn't last all that long.
My grandfather, William C. Vereter, decided to plant a big orchard up behind one of the hogbacks. And there were other orchards going on, and Kuhner Empson and the folks, that was a canning company, and then there's a cherry canning company as well. The climate here is good for cherries. They had to be irrigated. But like across the lake, that was known as Cherry Hill. Solid cherry orchards. And they were picked, you know, pretty much by locals. Sometimes they'd bring in some laborers, maybe Hispanic folks from Pueblo or the South, to pick them. But it was a big industry. Sour cherries.
Well, there were a lot of cherry orchards in this whole
yeah.
area.
Yeah.
But around the lake, there was cherry orchards on the north side and the west side. I can remember that quite well. But there were cherry orchards around Loveland, and we had cherries in our yard too.
Most everybody had a cherry tree.
Most families used to go out and pick cherries. I mean, most families, many families.
Many.
You'd take the whole family, grandpa and grandma and all the grandkids and everybody would just go out, and you'd pick up a box, a crate about this big, and it's cut in half. You just go fill it up.
We had ladders.
And you turn it in and keep track of how many
Cherries.
Stack them up, and then you got like, I don't know, 50 cents a crate or something like that.
It was not a real fun job because most of us will remember it was in the summer and it was warm, and if you got a gang, then you could go and hire on to pick cherries. It was all well and good for about the first hour. And after that, when you started getting hot and sticky and the cherry juice was running down your arms, which ran the bees and the flies, it was not real wonderful, but it was something we all did, and it was just common.
There was a canning factory, Kuhner Remsen was the name of it, and they did canning of cherries and a few other things, although I never worked there and I never had any direct connection, but a lot of people got summer jobs there. I recall that.
They got mowed down because of progress.
Building
and the best commercial way to stop traffic on 34 from going to Estes Park was to start building business. One of the stronger businesses was where like dermatology is now, and it was the Dude Corral.
Dude Corral. Yeah.
The Dude Corral was a great place to go eat, and it was a very famous place. That's the building that the dermatology business is in today. And it was just we were beginning to realize that people were going through 34 to get to Estes Park. And the city fathers wisely decided we've got to stop them here in Loveland, so they spent some money. So the motels started coming up, and then homes started building, and then later, much later, Loveland High School moved from where it used to be, which was Bill Reed Junior Senior High School on 4th Street, and Loveland High School moved to the north end of the lake, and that really started more homes being built in that direction.
Well, you know, and at my first school was Miss Angove, and she was kindergarten teacher.
We did not have public kindergarten.
It wasn't part of the school system at that time. And we just a normal little thing. We can remember
little private
doing a
kindergarten.
little thing, and you had to get your own blanket. You had to bring your blanket, and so that's when I first started. And then I went to Garfield School in the first grade, which is where Truscott is now. And my first grade teacher was Miss Coy, who has the Florence Coy, who gave money for the First Methodist Church activity center there. And Miss Coy had a philosophy: she didn't want you to get too complacent, so she never gave you an A. So you get perfect on a spelling test, and that was a B+. And so all my best grades were B+. That's all you could do. You couldn't do any better, because she figured if you get an A, you get complacent and lazy, and she didn't believe in that. So
I remember in 1965, Freddie and I led a group of about 125 people studying the structure of the school system and how we would staff and finance and so on. And we came up with a fine school system, except it offered nothing to gifted children. And so a group of us studied how to change that, and borrowed, with their permission, a system of of questioning that was kind of Socratic that the parish system in Denver, the Roman Catholics used, and they trained us, and we had the school children at that time were identified by the school system, and there were a lot of us who really enjoyed doing that. We had lots of Betcher scholars. We had wonderful teachers. A Betcher scholar is a person who qualifies in many different ways to a full ride scholarship to any Colorado school, and it's quite an honor to get a Betcher scholarship. And I think we probably had at least one every year, and so it was a good school system.
The development of the school system is interesting because when we came here, there were very few. There was Truscott Junior High, there was Garfield, there was Bill Reed, and when we came to town, Bill Reed was the high school. It was still the high school. And then Loveland developed quite a growth spurt, and it was obvious they were going to have to go out and build a high school. And at that time, Lake Loveland, there was a cherry orchard at the west side of Lake Loveland. That was the Crow property, and then there was farmland on the north side. And Jim Elijah, a builder in town, had plans to develop the land on the north side of Lake Loveland. And somebody came along and wanted to put a hotel up there. And the school board found out that the property was in the process of negotiation, so they got a hold of Mr. Elijah and ended up buying that for Loveland High School. Mm-hmm. And that's how Loveland High started.
Well, originally there were 3 grade schools in Loveland, and they were named after the streets that they were on. And that's all changed now. Washington School was the City Hall, what is now the City Hall on Washington, built in 1906. And my mother, I think, was in that first class in 1906 when it was built. The second, or about the same time, there was a Garfield School, which is confusing, was on Garfield at the very location where Truscott Elementary now sits. And it was Garfield. And then Lincoln, the school I went to, was up on Lincoln, and it took that full block where Walgreens sits now. So those are the 3 grade schools, named after the streets they were on. Later, of course, Garfield moved to a different place, Washington was no more, and then Lincoln actually moved to a different place. And the high school and junior high were in the same complex that Bill Reed is.
I went to Washington grade school, starting in the 3rd grade, and one of the things that I think is important about Loveland schools back then was that the school board understood the importance of good educations and a well-rounded education. So, thanks to Mrs. Foote, way back, Miss Edmondson, Lorene Edmondson, was the music teacher for all Loveland schools. We had 4 elementary schools, and the junior senior high was housed in one building, which is now Reed. And she spent her entire life going from all those elementary schools to each class, as well as, and teaching us music, as well as junior high and senior high. She was extremely revered. There's a school named after her now. But one of the things she did that I think was really particularly maybe unique to Loveland was that every spring we had a spring sing. And Miss Edmondson, during the whole year, would teach all children, starting in the 3rd grade, not 1st and 2nd graders, 3rd graders. We all came together one evening to the gymnasium at Loveland High School, and every child in Loveland who went to school in Loveland from the 3rd grade through seniors in high school sang. and we were in the gym on the floor with bleachers, went practically up to the balcony, and then the senior high people and junior high were in the balcony, and we all learned the same songs, the same teacher, and we each were featured. Each class was featured, each group of kids, all third graders, all fourth graders. It was an amazing thing to do. The entire town turned out for that event, and it was something everybody looked forward to the whole year.
And she ran a tight ship.
She ran a very tight ship.
She could snap her fingers and it sounded like a gun going off.
We were
you know, she'd book some kid messing around, and she'd
we sat straight on our seats.
Yeah.
We never took our eyes off of her. She was a marvelous music teacher.
And that, I was thinking of another thing we did in elementary school was had like a traveling troupe of some kind would come through and do a play or something, a musical
performance.
play, a performance.
At the community building.
At the community building.
In the auditorium.
And we'd all march down there from our various schools. We'd walk down, of course, and attend that. And they'd have the whole town would be there, whole town of kids would be there for those. And that was done.
And that was free.
Maybe once a year. I don't
Yeah.
think it was done more than that, if I recall. But,
So we had a little culture.
yeah, well, yeah, a little traveling culture. Yeah. Another big thing we had was elementary track meet. All the elementary schools had an annual track meet, and each school had their colors, and you'd tie the colors on your wrist,
Ribbons.
around your wrist, and so we had Washington, and they were called the Washington Wash Tubs. That's we used to make fun of them. Lincoln Stinkin', and Garfield Garbage Cans, and then Big Thompson was added, and I don't ever remember a nickname for Big Thompson. They were added a little bit later. But we would do, from first grade on,
One huge track meet.
Do one huge track meet during the day there.
At the high school track
At
field.
the high school field. And R.W. Truscott, the superintendent, was the starter. So we'd all...
But he didn't use a gun.
No, it was all by the hand. Normal running plus hoops. You'd have a stick and...
And rolled a hoop.
Just call it hoops. And you push that hoop. And then you had three-legged races.
And each school was
sack
competing,
races, sack
each
races.
grade and each school competed against the other grades in the other schools.
Yeah.
And then there was a board that kept track. And it was a big deal for your school to win.
And then
it was huge.
And then they put the school colors on the community building downtown in order of your finish.
Of your finish.
And Garfield, being the smaller of the schools, we were always third. Lincoln and Washington used to switch off every now and then.
We practiced relays around the school. All the schools were generally set in the middle of a square, a middle of a block. And so we would practice relays running all the way around each leg was one leg of the block. But nobody ever taught us how to change the sticks. So we always changed the sticks on the corner, which was pretty difficult to do. And the police in town knew we were practicing and literally would stop traffic. So every school who was practicing on their block where their school was had no cars to worry with. That's why I think we always felt, as I said earlier, cherished and protected, and we were important. We felt really important to the community. Steve and I dated in high school. I was a junior, he was a senior. Junior and senior proms, again, the community building, which is the Pulliam building, was the place for those kinds of things. So again, the community handed over the basement of the community building for us to put on a prom. And each junior class would redecorate that entire building. I mean, we would make false ceilings, we'd put in curtains, all those kinds of things on our own time, but we never had to rent the building, and that's where we had junior and senior prom.
Well, there were some things that were sort of fun when we first moved here. And one was in high school, when the kids graduated, they had what's called Rag Day. And they would come to school all dressed in rags in the beginning. As the years went by, they decided that they would give a performance. So they had a parade, and as they paraded, they had songs and skits that they did while they were marching along the street. And I think that went on for about 30 years, and then it kind of fizzled away. But it was great fun.
The schools were a really big part of our life. I mean, you know, and if you didn't participate in athletics, then you participated in band or choir. I was in the choir. My mother thought that would be fun, and I mean, we had a whole bunch of the football team in our choir, and really school was, everything centered around school. We had a thing called Rag Day, which started out in the 20s, I think, with the kids coming to school in rags and dressing up kind of as a mild protest or something. And that had turned into a vaudeville extravaganza by the time I was in high school. And our little group of about 12 guys, we won first place 4 years in a row, primarily because of my mother's shepherding us, and we danced and sang and did, and they filled the gymnasium there at Bill Reed, and I mean, everybody in Loveland came to that. I don't even know if they charged. Maybe they charged a little bit. It was put on by the L Club, the Letterman's Club, but it was a big thing, women's and men's skits. And if you talk to somebody my age about Rag Day, they go, oh yeah, I remember those skits. And then we had parades that were part of Rag Day. We had the Pet and Doll Parade, whole different thing, which happened at the last day of school. They still have it, but it isn't near as dramatic. It would go down 4th Street, and you dress up and take your pet and your dolls and whatever, and your bicycles, and do that. But school was it, and Loveland's always had competitive, athletics, but also choir, band.
Another big thing in high school was the Rag Day. It had two names to it: L Club Vaudeville or Rag Day. Mm-hmm. And the L Club, it was sort of the sponsorship of the L Club, and I think they took the proceeds and bought athletic insurance. I think that was the whole start of this process. And everybody that wanted to participated in some way or another. Big skits you'd get 10 people together, 10 kids together, and do a skit, or you get 2 of you to do something, anything you wanted to do. And you'd put on the show in the morning, and then it would be judged, and they decided which one of those were good enough to go on the night show. And then we had a Saturday night show too. Mm-hmm. So we had 3 times we put that on, and we would practice those things for weeks. If you had a group of people, you'd go to somebody's house or basement or garage or somewhere and practice a dance skit or whatever you were doing. And we'd spend a lot of time. I mean, you always tried to keep it secret. You didn't want anybody to know what you were doing. And if your parents were making costumes, your mom was making a costume for you, that had to be kept secret too. So nobody would know until the final day what you were doing. I think we got a good education. Mm-hmm. I felt like I was reasonably well prepared for life.
Mm-hmm. And college.
And we had a good sports program. The Loveland was always pretty good in football and track. And
were you involved?
And I was, mm-hmm. Yes, I was. And I was our 1954 and 1955 track teams won state 2 years in a row, and we were the smallest big school in the state.
Truscott was opened as a 2-year junior high, and I opened it as an 8th grader, and it was supposed to take care of all the growth needs in Loveland for the near future, but something happened in 1960.
Gradually, we began to grow, and when Hewlett-Packard came in 1960, it was a real change in atmosphere, and they brought some intellectual character to town.
It changed the philosophy of the community, and they were very compatible. They wanted to be part of the community, and so they really tried. They reached out to members in the community. There weren't many of us that were young enough to be interesting, but they'd had parties, and they'd have an art show. Everybody come and bring a piece of your artwork that you've done. Fun things like that. And there was always dancing, and it was just very enjoyable to be with these people. They were full of enthusiasm and excited about what was happening, and they liked Loveland, even though some of them came thinking, "Oh, what are we going to do in this dead place?" Well, it wasn't dead, and it came to life again. And for us who had just moved there, it was delightful.
I want to say, too, that Hewlett-Packard was really instrumental in helping us with a lot of the things that happened in town. We were both on the board of United Way, and they offered loan to executives, they offered help, they offered, they had a Christmas party every year for their children, of Hewlett-Packard families. And if they didn't give away all the gifts, they gave those to Philo to give at Christmas. And they were a different set of people from the original agriculture people, and you know, they really raised the bar, let's say, on who we are as a town.
Well, it totally changed it from an agricultural base to a technology base.
David Packard had grown up in Pueblo. And I'm pretty certain that's correct. I always get confused whether it was Hewlett or Packard, but I think it was Packard. And he'd gone through the schools in Pueblo. He knew Colorado. And then when they got out to Palo Alto, of course, they created their company and were world-renowned. But in 1960, through some initiative, not sure what, but the folks that were involved were Bob Hips. He was mayor. He was a very prominent, had a very big appliance store right in there next to the Black Steer on Lincoln. And he was one of Loveland's bigger merchants. We didn't have any big boxes. And he, as mayor, and then Paul Rice, who was president of the First National Bank, and a very capable founder and did a lot of things here in Loveland, they decided, look, we need to build Loveland. It's a nice place to live. We have everything, but we need some industry. And high-tech industry would be excellent. So they took a trip with, I think, one other individual, I can't remember, probably a Chamber of Commerce executive, and they went out to Palo Alto, and they sold the idea that Loveland would donate some land, and that we had a beautiful site up on the hill. Would they come out and take a look? And they did. And they sold Hewlett-Packard. I think Colorado Springs may have had a small outlet at that time for Hewlett-Packard, but Loveland was the first off-site place. And they did, my father was city attorney, and they did what's called a flagpole annexation, meaning they just went down the railroad right-of-way and the railroad avenue there and went way up the hill and created an annexation to get that land into the city. And I don't know what incentives were given, but there were incentives given.
Oh, I think Hewlett-Packard had a terrific impact on Loveland because it brought in paychecks for so many people, and not just minimum wage paychecks. It wasn't like Great Western Sugar, where you were working with a seasonal bunch of people, but you had a big company come in, not only build a huge building up on the hill, but brought in people, and those people are the ones that really want good schools. They want to raise their kids in a wonderful town, and so I think it did nothing but help out the city of Loveland.
I was in high school, and I mean, Hewlett-Packard changed our community, and one of the biggest changes is so many housewives and underemployed women in this community then had good paying jobs, a lot of work with the circuit boards and good work, clean environment, and they had health insurance. And that was so important because the farmers, a lot of the husbands were farmers, and it just gave a real big impact to an awful lot of my friends' mothers. And then, of course, we got the very capable electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, highly educated people, some from CSU, from other universities, that came into Loveland and transformed the community, literally. I mean, even our little football team, they brought some big, strong boys in, and we did a lot better the next 2 or 3 years in football. It was such an influx of people. And of course, the great thing is so many of them were so well educated. And the electrical engineers and the executives those were very good salaries compared to the sugar factory worker maybe, or a laborer. And then they brought with them, I mean, they came from Princeton and MIT and University of Texas and all these, exotic places that no one here in Loveland had almost even heard of. And they transformed our schools. They got on the school boards. We raised and passed bond issues because they wanted their kids to be educated better. And we spent money, and we had the money to spend because of the higher salaries, and then bigger homes were built, and the tax base expanded, and Loveland began to have its own identity. I mean, it had an identity before, but we were always the sort of the sidekick, stepchild to Fort Collins. The biggest change that I've always thought that Hewlett-Packard did is I was probably the first generation, graduating in 1962, that really came back to Loveland after I went off and got my law degree and practiced a little while in Boulder. People usually left Loveland who went into professions or went into executive corporate jobs. They didn't come back to Loveland except for a class reunion. And we started coming back. And of course that has made a big difference because there was something to come back to. But I saw what was happening and thought, I want to get in on this.
Well, HP had a subsidiary, Agilent, and HP built a big campus in Fort Collins. And so they split and left Agilent here, and they moved the manufacturing facilities for Hewlett-Packard to Fort Collins. And at the same time, they built a big facility in Greeley, and that functioned for a while. Loveland kept Agilent, and then Agilent spun off, and then the city council acquired the land from Agilent for their incubator plans on new businesses.